It's starting to feel like something nobody expected might actually happen. The WNBA is growing faster than it ever has before. Arenas are finally selling out. TV ratings are exploding. New fans are pouring in from all over the country. And at the center of all that momentum is one name everyone already knows, Caitlyn Clark. But just as the league is entering what could be the most important era in its entire history, something behind the scenes is threatening to bring everything to a complete stop. Because right now, there's a massive fight happening inside the WNBA. A fight over money, power, control, and the future of the league itself. Owners and players have been locked in negotiations for months trying to agree on a brand new collective bargaining agreement. The deal that determines salaries, revenue sharing, benefits, and basically how the entire business of the WNBA operates. These negotiations are supposed to shape the league for years to come. But instead of progress, what we've seen is drama. Public arguments, leaked letters, players calling out their own union leadership, and now a deadline that just passed with no agreement at all. That deadline was supposed to be the moment both sides finally came together and locked in a deal that would guarantee the start of the 2026 WNBA season. A season that fans were already calling the biggest in league history. But when the clock hit March 10th, nothing happened. No deal. No agreement. And suddenly the question that nobody wanted to ask started spreading everywhere across the basketball world. Could the WNBA actually be heading toward a lockout or a strike? Right when the league is finally exploding in popularity. And if that happens, there's one player who might end up at the center of the entire storm, Caitlyn Clark. Because whether people want to admit it or not, Clark's arrival has completely changed the business of the WNBA. Ticket sales, television numbers, sponsorships, merchandise, everything has surged since she entered the league. Which means this labor battle isn't just about contracts anymore. It's about who gets to benefit from the Caitlyn Clark era. Some players believe this is the moment to demand a bigger share of the league's success. Owners believe they're already offering historic financial growth. And somewhere in the middle of all that tension, negotiations have started falling apart. But what most fans don't realize is that the real chaos might not even be between the league and the players. Because inside the players' union itself, serious cracks are starting to appear. And those cracks might be one of the biggest reasons this entire situation is spiraling out of control. But to understand how things reached this point, we have to go back to the moment the league set the deadline that put everything on the line. The deadline that put the entire WNBA season in danger. For months, both sides believed they would eventually reach an agreement. That's usually how labor negotiations work in professional sports. There's tension, there's posturing, and there are long nights of negotiations. But eventually a deal gets done. At least, that's how it's supposed to work. But as the calendar started moving closer to March, something became very clear. These negotiations weren't just slow. They were becoming increasingly hostile. Behind closed doors, the WNBA and the Women's National Basketball Players Association had been exchanging proposal after proposal. Each side believed they were making reasonable offers. Each side believed the other was being unrealistic. Owners were pushing a deal that would increase salaries and benefits significantly compared to the previous agreement. Players, on the other hand, believed the league's recent explosion in popularity meant they deserved an even larger share of the revenue. And on the surface, that might sound like a normal negotiation. But the deeper the talks went, the more complicated things became. Because this isn't the same WNBA that existed just a few years ago. For decades, the league struggled to gain consistent attention from mainstream sports fans. Attendance was uneven. Television coverage was limited. And many players had to supplement their income by playing overseas during the off-season. But the last few seasons have completely changed that narrative. The rise of women's college basketball created an entirely new generation of fans. Social media made the stars of the game more visible than ever before. And then, when Caitlyn Clark entered the league, something happened that even longtime observers didn't fully expect. Interest in the WNBA skyrocketed. Games started selling out in cities that had never seen crowds like that before. National television broadcasts suddenly began drawing millions of viewers. Merchandise sales exploded, and media coverage of the league reached levels it had never experienced in its entire history. For the first time, the WNBA wasn't just surviving. It was growing, and that growth created a brand new financial reality. Players began looking at the numbers, and asking an important question. If the league is finally generating real momentum, shouldn't they be sharing more directly in that success? That question became the foundation of the current negotiations. The Players' Union pushed for a major shift in how revenue would be shared between the league and its athletes. Their argument was simple. If the business is expanding because of the players on the court, then those players should receive a larger percentage of the money being generated. Owners responded by pointing out that they had already proposed major financial improvements compared to previous agreements. Salary caps were increasing. Minimum contracts were rising. Benefits and travel accommodations were being improved. From their perspective, the league was already offering a historic deal. But the union believed the moment demanded something bigger. And as negotiations stretched deeper into the year, both sides began digging in their heels. That's when the league decided to set a hard deadline. March 10th. That was the date officials publicly stated that both sides needed to finalize a term sheet for the new agreement. If they didn't reach that milestone, the timeline for preparing the upcoming season could start slipping. At first, many people assumed the deadline would simply force both sides to move faster. In sports labor negotiations, deadlines often serve as pressure points that finally push everyone to compromise. But as March approached, something unexpected started happening. Instead of quiet progress, the negotiations began spilling into the public eye. Players started speaking openly about their frustrations. League representatives defended their proposals. Media outlets began reporting that the two sides were still far apart on key issues. And then another layer of tension emerged, internal disagreements among the players themselves. Some athletes believed the union should hold firm and fight for the maximum possible revenue share. Others privately worried that pushing too far could lead to a lockout or a delayed season. For many players across the league, missing games wouldn't just be inconvenient. It could be financially devastating. Unlike the highest-paid stars, the majority of WNBA players rely heavily on their seasonal income. A missed season could mean lost salaries, lost endorsements, and serious financial uncertainty. That reality created a silent divide inside the player community. But the public message from union leadership remained strong. They insisted the players were united and committed to negotiating for as long as necessary to secure what they believed was a transformational deal. Meanwhile, the league continued presenting revised proposals, hoping to find common ground. As the final week before the deadline arrived, negotiations intensified dramatically. Counteroffers were exchanged. Meetings were scheduled. Long discussions stretched late into the night. From the outside, it looked like progress might finally be happening. But when March 10th finally arrived, the result shocked a lot of people watching closely. The deadline came and went, and there was still no agreement. No finalized deal. No announcement. Just silence, followed by the growing realization that the league and the players' union had failed to reach the moment everyone expected. Suddenly, the entire basketball world started asking the same question. What happens now? Because if the negotiations continue to stall, the ripple effects could impact everything from preseason planning to the opening tip-off of the 2026 season. And if that season gets delayed, the timing couldn't be worse. Not when the league is finally capturing national attention. Not when expansion teams are preparing to enter the league. And definitely not when the biggest star in women's basketball is about to headline what should have been the most anticipated season the WNBA has ever seen. But as serious as the missed deadline is, it might not even be the biggest problem in this entire situation. Because the real battle behind the scenes isn't just about when the season starts. It's about something far more complicated. Money. And the fight over who deserves the biggest share of the WNBA's rapidly growing success. And that battle is where things start getting even more intense. The billion-dollar question. Who really gets the money? Once the March 10th deadline passed without a deal, the conversation around the WNBA changed almost instantly. At first, most fans were just confused. They assumed negotiations were probably close and that a deal would be announced soon. After all, that's usually how these situations play out in professional sports. Deadlines get extended, both sides meet again, and eventually everyone finds a compromise. But the more details started leaking out about the negotiations, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a small disagreement. This was a full-blown battle over money, and more specifically, over how the future financial success of the WNBA should be divided between the league and the players. To understand why this argument has become so intense, you have to understand how dramatically the league's financial situation has changed over the past few years. For most of its history, the WNBA operated in a completely different economic environment than men's professional leagues. Revenue was limited. Television exposure was inconsistent. Sponsorships were smaller. And because of that, players' salaries were relatively modest compared to other major sports. That reality is one of the reasons many WNBA players historically chose to play overseas during the off-season. International leagues often offered significantly higher salaries, making it financially necessary for many players to spend months away from home just to maximize their income. But recently, something started shifting. Television deals began improving. Media coverage expanded. Corporate sponsorships increased. And perhaps most importantly, interest in women's basketball began growing rapidly across the United States. College stars were becoming national celebrities before they even entered the professional league. Social media gave players massive platforms to connect with fans. And suddenly, the WNBA started attracting a level of attention it had never consistently experienced before. Then Caitlyn Clark arrived. Almost immediately, everything accelerated. Games featuring Clark began selling out arenas across the country. Television ratings surged whenever she was playing. Even road games started drawing record crowds as fans showed up just to watch her compete. For the first time, the WNBA wasn't just gaining attention from longtime supporters of women's basketball. It was capturing the interest of casual sports fans who had never previously watched the league. That surge in popularity created enormous excitement for the future. But it also created a very important question. If the league is finally experiencing significant growth, how should that new money be distributed? The Players' Union believes the athletes themselves should receive a larger percentage of the league's revenue. Their argument is simple. The players are the product. The league's success depends on their talent, their performance, and their ability to draw fans. From their perspective, the rapid growth of the WNBA proves that the value of the players has increased dramatically, which means their share of the financial success should increase as well. Union representatives have reportedly pushed for a revenue-sharing structure that would give players a larger percentage of the league's overall income. The exact numbers have shifted throughout negotiations, but the core demand remains the same. Players want a bigger piece of the pie, but the league has pushed back strongly against that demand. From the owner's point of view, the WNBA is still a developing business that requires continued investment to grow sustainably. Operating a professional sports league involves enormous costs. Team operations, travel, marketing, arena expenses, broadcasting partnerships, and long-term development initiatives. League executives argue that while revenues are improving, the financial structure of the league still requires careful management. In response to the union's demands, the league reportedly offered significant improvements to player compensation, higher minimum salaries, increased salary caps, better travel conditions, expanded benefits for players and their families. From the owner's perspective, the proposal represented a historic step forward for the league. But for the players' union, it wasn't enough. Because the debate isn't just about salary increases anymore. It's about the long-term economic structure of the entire league. Players want a system where their earnings grow directly alongside the league's revenue. If television deals expand, if sponsorships increase, if attendance keeps rising, they want those financial gains to be reflected immediately in player compensation. Owners, on the other hand, prefer a system that prioritizes financial stability and gradual growth. And that difference in philosophy has turned negotiations into a prolonged standoff. But as complicated as the financial debate already is, something happened during these negotiations that made the situation even more explosive. Because the conflict didn't just stay between the league and the union. Instead, it started spreading inside the Players Association itself. Behind the scenes, some of the league's biggest stars were becoming increasingly frustrated with how negotiations were being handled. And eventually, that frustration exploded into the open in a way that nobody expected. The letter that exposed chaos inside the Players' Union. Labor negotiations in professional sports are usually tense. Players want the best possible deal. Owners want to protect their investments. And the union leadership acts as the bridge between those two sides. But in the WNBA's current negotiations, something unusual started happening. Instead of presenting a completely unified front, signs of internal disagreement began surfacing among the players themselves. And those signs became impossible to ignore when a private letter written by two of the league's most prominent stars suddenly leaked to the public. The letter reportedly came from Breanna Stewart and Kelsey Plum, two players who sit on the executive committee of the Women's National Basketball Players Association. These are not fringe voices within the league. These are major figures with influence inside the union's leadership structure, which is why what they wrote immediately caught everyone's attention. According to reports, the letter raised serious concerns about the way negotiations were being handled by union leadership. The players expressed frustration about communication, transparency, and the flow of information between the negotiating team and the rest of the players. In simple terms, some players felt like they weren't being fully informed about what was happening in negotiations that could determine the future of their careers. That's a serious accusation inside any labor organization. When athletes put their trust in union leadership, they expect to be kept informed about proposals, counteroffers, and strategic decisions. They want to know what the league is offering. They want to know what compromises are being considered. And they want to know how close negotiations actually are to reaching a deal. But according to the concerns raised in the letter, some players believed that communication inside the union had broken down. Information wasn't reaching everyone. Questions were going unanswered. And some players reportedly felt like major decisions were being made without sufficient input from the broader group. Once that letter became public, the situation instantly became more complicated. Because now the narrative around the negotiations wasn't just about players versus owners anymore. It was about internal division within the Players Association. Some players defended the union leadership and insisted that negotiations were being handled responsibly. They argued that public leaks and internal criticism could weaken the union's bargaining position during an already difficult negotiation. Others believed the letter exposed legitimate concerns about transparency and leadership. Suddenly, the Players Association found itself fighting a battle on two different fronts. On one side, they were negotiating against league executives and team owners over the financial structure of the future WNBA. On the other side, they were dealing with growing questions from within their own ranks. And the timing of that internal conflict couldn't have been worse. Because as negotiations approached the March deadline, the last thing the union needed was public controversy about its leadership. But once the letter leaked, there was no way to put the issue back in the shadows. The story spread quickly across sports media. Fans began debating what it meant. Analysts started questioning whether the players were truly united in their demands. And league officials watching the situation unfold may have realized something important. If the players themselves were divided, the negotiations could become even more unpredictable. But while the internal drama was capturing headlines, another element of the story was quietly becoming impossible to ignore. Because throughout all of these negotiations, the financial arguments, the internal conflicts, the missed deadlines, one name kept coming up over and over again: Caitlyn Clark. Whether fans realized it or not, Clark's arrival had fundamentally changed the entire economic conversation around the WNBA. And in many ways, she had become the most important factor shaping this entire labor battle. Because the league's sudden explosion in popularity wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was happening during the very moment Caitlyn Clark stepped onto a WNBA court. And that coincidence has sparked a debate that might be even more controversial than the negotiations themselves. Why Caitlyn Clark is suddenly at the center of the entire debate. At first, Caitlyn Clark wasn't supposed to be part of this story. The negotiations between the league and the players' union were already happening long before she entered the WNBA. Labor agreements take years to negotiate, and most of the financial discussions were already underway before Clark ever played her first professional game. But once she stepped onto a WNBA court, something changed that nobody inside the league could ignore. The attention surrounding the WNBA exploded. For years, league officials had been trying to find ways to expand the audience for women's professional basketball. They invested in marketing campaigns, broadcasting partnerships, youth outreach programs, and new sponsorship opportunities. Slowly but steadily, those efforts were beginning to pay off. But Clark's arrival accelerated everything. Suddenly, arenas were selling out in cities that rarely filled their seats before. Television broadcasts were drawing numbers that rivaled some established professional sports programming. Social media clips from WNBA games were spreading across the internet at incredible speed. Fans who had never followed the league before were now watching every highlight. Merchandise sales surged. Ticket demand skyrocketed. Even opposing teams started moving games into larger arenas whenever Clark came to town. For many observers, it felt like the league had finally reached the moment it had been waiting for. But inside the world of professional sports business, moments like this always raise the same question. Who benefits from the growth? That question became unavoidable during the CBA negotiations. Because while Clark's popularity was helping drive new attention toward the league, her rookie contract was already locked in under the existing salary structure. Like every other player entering the league through the draft system, Clark's contract followed a fixed rookie scale. That meant one of the most influential players in women's basketball was earning a salary that many people believed didn't fully reflect her economic impact. Of course, Clark isn't the only player contributing to the league's growth. The WNBA has talented veterans, rising stars, championship contenders, and a growing fan base that extends far beyond a single player. But even league executives privately acknowledge that Clark's arrival created a surge of attention that changed the financial landscape almost overnight. And that reality inevitably became part of the negotiation conversation. Some players see the current moment as an opportunity. If the league is finally generating major interest, if television ratings are increasing, if sponsorship deals are expanding, then the players believe this is exactly the time to negotiate a larger share of the league's revenue. From their perspective, this is the moment where the value of the WNBA players has clearly increased. But others have pointed out a complicated reality. While the league is growing rapidly, much of that growth has been fueled by the arrival of a few extremely high-profile stars. And when negotiations start revolving around the financial impact of specific players, the conversation can become uncomfortable very quickly. Some fans believe the union is trying to capitalize on the Clark era to secure larger financial gains. Others believe that Clark's popularity proves the players deserve a bigger share of the league's success. Both arguments have gained traction in the public debate. Meanwhile, Clark herself has largely stayed out of the controversy. Whenever she has spoken publicly about the negotiations, her comments have focused on the importance of reaching an agreement. She has encouraged both sides to continue talking and emphasized that the players want to be on the court competing. But even as she tries to avoid the center of the debate, her presence continues to shape the entire situation. Because the reality is simple. The WNBA is entering a new era of popularity and visibility. And Caitlyn Clark has become one of the biggest symbols of that new era. Which means every financial decision being negotiated right now will directly impact the environment she plays in for the rest of her career. But as intense as the financial debate has already become, another issue is quietly making the situation even more complicated. Because behind the scenes, some players are starting to worry about what could happen if negotiations go too far. And those concerns have created a new layer of tension that the public is only beginning to understand. The quiet fear. Some players can't afford a lockout. When fans hear about labor negotiations in professional sports, they often assume every athlete involved is earning massive amounts of money. In leagues like the NBA, NFL, or MLB, even mid-level players often earn millions of dollars per season. That financial cushion gives players the ability to withstand long negotiations, or even a work stoppage if necessary. But the financial reality inside the WNBA is very different. While the league has grown tremendously in recent years, the majority of players still operate under salary structures that are significantly smaller than those in larger professional leagues. For many athletes in the WNBA, their salary during the season represents the primary source of their income. Some players supplement their earnings through endorsement deals. Others have historically traveled overseas during the off-season to compete in international leagues where salaries can sometimes be higher. But even with those additional opportunities, missing an entire WNBA season would be a serious financial challenge for many players. And that's why the idea of a potential lockout or strike has created anxiety across the league. While union leadership may believe holding firm during negotiations will ultimately produce a better deal, not every player feels comfortable with the risks involved in that strategy. Several reports have indicated that some players privately worry about what would happen if the season is delayed or canceled entirely. Losing games doesn't just mean losing the opportunity to compete. It means losing paychecks. It means losing endorsement visibility. It means losing valuable career time in a league where professional playing windows are already relatively short. Those concerns have created quiet tension within the player community. On one side are players who believe this negotiation represents a historic opportunity to reshape the economic structure of the WNBA. They argue that meaningful progress often requires difficult negotiations, and sometimes sacrifices must be made to secure long-term gains. On the other side are players who understand the importance of negotiating a strong deal, but worry about how far the standoff could go. If negotiations break down completely, the league could face its first true labor crisis in history. And unlike other professional leagues with enormous financial reserves, the WNBA is still navigating its growth phase. A prolonged work stoppage could disrupt momentum at the exact moment the league is finally reaching new audiences. That possibility has many people inside the basketball world feeling uneasy. Because if the league loses the opportunity to build on its current popularity, it could slow the progress that players, fans, and executives have worked years to achieve. But despite those concerns, negotiations have continued to stall. Proposals have been exchanged. Meetings have taken place. Long conversations have stretched late into the night. Yet every time it seems like progress might finally be happening, another obstacle appears. And when one final marathon negotiation session took place shortly before the deadline, many people believed the breakthrough was finally coming. But what happened during that meeting only made the situation more uncertain. Because even after hours of discussion, the deal still wasn't finished. And the league found itself standing at a moment that could define its future. The negotiation that lasted all night and still failed. As the deadline approached, pressure inside the WNBA grew to a level the league had rarely experienced before. For months, negotiations had been slow and complicated. But once the calendar moved into the final stretch before March 10th, both sides understood that time was running out. If an agreement wasn't reached soon, the timeline for preparing the upcoming season could start slipping. That realization pushed everyone back to the negotiating table for what many believed would finally be the breakthrough meeting. Reports began surfacing that league officials, team owners, and representatives from the players' union were preparing for a marathon round of negotiations. The goal was simple: stay in the room as long as necessary until both sides could finalize a deal. This wasn't just another routine meeting. This was supposed to be the moment where the months of arguments, proposals, and counteroffers finally turned into a signed agreement. The kind of meeting where people bring coffee, stay up all night, and refuse to leave until something gets done. And for a while, it looked like progress might actually be happening. Both sides came into the meeting with revised proposals. The league had reportedly made adjustments to its previous offers, trying to address some of the concerns raised by the players' union. At the same time, the union had softened certain demands compared to their earliest negotiating positions. That kind of movement is usually the sign that negotiations are getting close. Inside the room, discussions stretched hour after hour. League executives laid out their financial projections for the future of the WNBA. Union representatives argued that the players deserved a larger share of the league's growing success. At times, the conversation reportedly became tense. But that's normal during negotiations of this magnitude. When the future financial structure of an entire league is being debated, emotions can run high. Still, the expectation among many people following the situation was that the meeting would eventually produce a compromise, because that's how these stories usually end. But as the hours continued to pass, it became clear that the gap between the two sides was still larger than many people had realized. Even after hours of discussion, critical disagreements remained unresolved. Revenue sharing, salary structures, long-term financial guarantees. These weren't small details that could be adjusted with a quick signature. They were fundamental questions about how the league would operate for years to come. And neither side was willing to back down completely. Eventually, the marathon session ended without the moment everyone had been waiting for. No deal. No finalized agreement. Just more uncertainty. As the meeting concluded, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The March 10th deadline was now directly in front of them, and the negotiations still weren't finished. For fans watching from the outside, the situation was starting to feel surreal. The WNBA had spent years building momentum. Attendance numbers were climbing. Television coverage was expanding. New fans were discovering the league every season. And now, right when everything seemed to be moving forward, The possibility of a major labor conflict was suddenly becoming real. But as shocking as the failed negotiation session was, the next question became even more important. What happens if the two sides still can't reach a deal? Because if the negotiations continue to stall, the consequences could stretch far beyond a missed deadline. They could affect the entire future of the league. Could the 2026 WNBA season actually be at risk? Once the deadline passed without an agreement, the conversation around the league changed immediately. For months, the negotiations had mostly been treated as a business story, a complicated but ultimately routine process that happens in professional sports from time to time. But now that the deadline had come and gone, the stakes suddenly felt much higher. Because without a finalized agreement, the possibility of a disrupted season became impossible to ignore. In professional sports, labor disputes can lead to two different outcomes. A strike, where players refuse to participate until a deal is reached. Or a lockout, where team owners prevent players from competing until negotiations are resolved. Either scenario can bring an entire league to a standstill. Games get postponed, training camps get delayed, schedules fall apart, and fans are left wondering when, or if, the season will actually begin. The WNBA has never experienced a crisis quite like that before. Throughout its history, the league has managed to navigate labor negotiations without losing an entire season. But the current situation is different in one important way. The league is growing faster than it ever has before. Expansion teams are preparing to join the league. Television deals are expanding. Corporate sponsors are investing more heavily in women's basketball. And new fans are discovering the WNBA every day. A prolonged labor dispute could disrupt all of that progress. Momentum in professional sports is incredibly valuable, but it can also be fragile. When fans become excited about a league, that excitement needs to be maintained through consistent competition, compelling storylines, and regular games. If that momentum suddenly disappears, rebuilding it can take years. That's one of the reasons many people inside the basketball world are hoping negotiations resume quickly. Both sides understand what's at stake. Players want a deal that reflects their growing value. Owners want a financial structure that protects the long-term stability of the league. In many ways, both goals are reasonable. But until those goals can be aligned in a single agreement, the uncertainty will continue hanging over the league. And the longer the situation remains unresolved, the louder the questions will become. Questions about the season, questions about the future, and questions about whether the league can maintain the incredible momentum it has built over the past few years. The hidden divide inside the WNBA that nobody wants to talk about. While most of the public conversation has focused on the battle between the league and the players' union, another reality has quietly been shaping this entire situation behind the scenes. Not every player in the WNBA views the negotiations the same way. From the outside, the union presents a unified front. Statements are released emphasizing solidarity. Leaders repeat the message that all players are standing together to fight for a better deal. But inside the league, the reality is more complicated. Because the WNBA is made up of players at very different stages of their careers, and those differences can influence how each player views the current negotiations. Veteran players who have been in the league for many years often see the current moment as a rare opportunity. Many of them spent most of their careers playing in a league that struggled for recognition. They traveled long distances on commercial flights, played in smaller arenas, and often had to compete overseas during the off-season just to earn the kind of salary that matched their talent. Now, after years of pushing the league forward, they are finally seeing the sport gain the attention they always believed it deserved. From their perspective, this is the moment to secure the financial progress that players have been fighting for over decades. If the league is finally becoming profitable and popular, they believe the players who built that foundation deserve to benefit from it. But younger players entering the league may see the situation slightly differently. For rookies and younger athletes, the WNBA already looks very different than it did a decade ago. They are entering a league that is growing quickly, receiving more media coverage, attracting bigger crowds, and generating far more attention from sponsors and broadcasters. For many of them, the most important thing is stability. They want the league to continue expanding. They want fans to keep showing up. They want television deals to keep growing so that future contracts can improve naturally over time. And that's where the tension sometimes appears. Veterans who fought through the difficult years may feel strongly that this is the time to demand major financial changes. Younger players, who are just beginning their careers, may feel more cautious about risking the league's current momentum. Neither perspective is wrong. Both are shaped by personal experiences inside the sport. But when those perspectives exist at the same time during a major negotiation, it can make it harder for the entire group to move in exactly the same direction. Some players are willing to push negotiations as far as necessary to achieve long-term financial gains. Others worry that pushing too hard could risk the growth the league is currently experiencing. Those differences don't always appear publicly. But inside any professional sports league, they are almost always present. And as negotiations continue, union leadership must balance all of those perspectives while still presenting a unified negotiating position to the league. That balancing act is incredibly difficult, because while players share many common goals, they also have different financial realities, different career timelines, and different views about how aggressive negotiations should be. Some players are thinking about their legacy. Others are thinking about their next contract. And some are simply hoping the season starts on time so they can get back on the court. All of those motivations exist simultaneously inside the league, which means the negotiations are not just about players versus owners. They're also about finding common ground within the player community itself. And as the deadline passes and the uncertainty continues, that internal balancing act becomes even more challenging. Because every day without a deal increases the pressure on everyone involved. Players begin wondering how long negotiations might last. Teams begin adjusting their preparation schedules. Fans begin questioning whether the season will start on time. And the longer those questions remain unanswered, the more complicated the situation becomes. But despite all the tension, most people involved in the league still believe a deal will eventually happen, because both sides understand something very important. The WNBA has finally reached a moment of real growth, and protecting that growth may ultimately become the most important goal of all. Why this negotiation could reshape women's basketball forever. What's happening right now inside the WNBA isn't just another sports negotiation. It may actually be one of the most important moments in the entire history of women's professional basketball. Because the outcome of this deal won't just decide what happens next season. It could decide what the league looks like for the next decade. To understand why, you have to step back and look at the bigger picture of how the WNBA has evolved over time. When the league first launched in 1997, the goal was simple but ambitious: create a permanent professional league for women's basketball in the United States. At the time, the idea was still uncertain. Women's professional leagues in other sports had struggled to survive long-term. There were questions about financial sustainability, media interest, and whether fans would consistently support a women's basketball league at the professional level. But over the years, the WNBA slowly built something that many people once believed might not be possible. The league survived difficult financial periods. Teams relocated or folded. Ownership groups changed. Television coverage expanded and contracted at different times. But through all of that, the players kept competing, the fans kept supporting the game, and the league continued moving forward. Every generation of players helped push the sport a little further. Stars like Lisa Leslie, Diana Taurasi, Sue Bird, Maya Moore, Candace Parker, and many others helped build the reputation of the league through their talent and dedication. They proved that women's basketball could produce incredible competition, unforgettable moments, and athletes capable of inspiring millions of young fans. But for much of the league's history, the financial side of the sport remained limited. Salaries were modest compared to other professional leagues. Many players still needed international contracts to maximize their income. And media attention, while growing, often remained smaller than players believed the sport deserved. That's why the current moment feels so different. For the first time in decades, the WNBA is experiencing a surge of attention that is impossible to ignore. New fans are discovering the league every season. Games are drawing larger crowds. Television broadcasts are attracting stronger ratings. Corporate sponsors are showing increased interest in partnering with the league. And the arrival of stars like Caitlyn Clark has accelerated that momentum in ways few people expected. In many ways, the WNBA is entering a phase similar to what other professional leagues experienced when they reached their first major growth boom. And when that kind of growth happens, the structure of the business often changes dramatically. Leagues renegotiate television contracts. Player salaries increase. Revenue-sharing models evolve. Expansion teams enter the league. Entire generations of athletes benefit from the financial progress created during these moments. That's why the current CBA negotiations feel so significant. This isn't just about next year's contracts. It's about defining how the success of the league will be shared in the future. If the players succeed in securing a larger share of league revenue, it could dramatically increase the earning potential for future generations of athletes. Young girls watching today could grow up entering a league where professional basketball is not only a dream career, but also a financially secure one. On the other hand, league officials must also consider long-term stability. Rapid financial changes can sometimes create challenges if growth slows unexpectedly. Owners must balance the desire to reward players with the responsibility of ensuring the league remains financially sustainable for years to come. That balance is what makes negotiations like this so complicated. Both sides believe they are protecting the future of the game. Both sides want the WNBA to succeed, but they have different ideas about the best way to achieve that success. And until those ideas come together in a single agreement, the uncertainty surrounding the league will continue. What makes this moment even more fascinating is that the WNBA is no longer operating in isolation. Women's sports across the world are experiencing unprecedented growth. Women's soccer, tennis, basketball, and other sports are drawing larger audiences than ever before. Corporate sponsors are recognizing the value of investing in women's athletics. Media networks are expanding coverage, and young athletes are growing up with more opportunities than any previous generation. The decisions made in this negotiation could influence how women's professional sports are structured far beyond the WNBA itself. If the league successfully navigates this moment, it could become a blueprint for how other women's sports leagues grow financially. If the negotiations become too divisive, however, it could slow the momentum that women's basketball has been building for years. That's why so many people across the sports world are watching closely. Because the outcome of these negotiations won't just determine when the next WNBA season starts. It could determine what the future of women's professional basketball looks like for generations to come. And that's exactly why both sides understand the importance of getting this decision right. The stakes have never been higher. Not for the players, not for the owners, and certainly not for the future of the sport itself. The future of the WNBA may be decided in the next few weeks. Right now, the WNBA stands at one of the most important crossroads in its history. On one side is a league that is finally gaining national attention, attracting new fans, and building the kind of momentum that players and executives have worked decades to achieve. On the other side is a complicated labor negotiation that could reshape the financial structure of the entire league. Both sides believe they are fighting for the future of the game. Players want to ensure that the athletes driving the league's success receive fair compensation and long-term financial security. Owners want to ensure that the league continues to grow in a way that remains financially sustainable for years to come. Those goals are not necessarily incompatible, but finding the balance between them has proven far more difficult than anyone expected. And as negotiations continue, one thing remains clear. The world is watching the WNBA more closely than ever before. Fans are paying attention. Media coverage is growing.